My life had become a study in beige. The walls of my house were a shade called landlord's dream, a non-color that absorbed light and offered nothing in return. My days were the same, a predictable sequence of brewing coffee, sitting at my desk, and watching the sun trace a familiar, indifferent arc across the beige plaster. I wrote historical biographies, spending my hours with ghosts, and had slowly, imperceptibly, become one myself. The silence of the house wasn't peaceful. It was hollow, an echo chamber for my own quiet loneliness. The decision to paint was less about aesthetics and more about survival. It was a desperate grasp for pigment, for something, anything, to disrupt the monochrome stillness. I found his number on a bulletin board at the local hardware store. Cole Evans Painting. No job too small. The name was solid, unpretentious. Like the man who showed up on my porch 2 days later. He was taller than I'd expected, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his faded gray t-shirt. His hair was the color of dark wood shavings, and his eyes, when they met mine, were a startlingly clear shade of green, like sea glass worn smooth by the tide. He carried the scent of the outdoors, sun-warmed skin, sawdust, and something else, something sharp and clean like turpentine. He wasn't handsome in the classical sense. His nose had been broken at least once, and a faint white scar cut through his left eyebrow. But he was real. Overwhelmingly, tangibly real in my world of dusty books and faded ink. "Julian?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. I nodded, my own voice feeling thin and reedy in comparison. "That's me." "You must be Cole." He gave a short, decisive nod, his gaze already sweeping over the peeling trim of the porch, assessing, calculating. "Got a ladder in the truck? Can take a look inside. Give you a proper quote." He didn't waste words. I like that. It was efficient. It was safe. He moved through my house with a quiet economy of motion that I, a man who often tripped over his own feet, could only envy. His hands, I noticed, were calloused and capable. They skimmed over door frames and tested the texture of the walls with a practiced intimacy. He was touching my house, my space, with a confidence I had never felt within it. I followed him like a satellite, orbiting his solid presence, acutely aware of the space between us. He was a man who worked with his body, who transformed things with his hands. I only worked with my mind, rearranging the dead facts of other people's lives. "It's a good house," he said, standing in the center of my living room. "Good bones. Just needs a bit of life breathed into it." He looked at me then, a direct, searching look. I felt my cheeks warm, a ridiculous blush rising for no reason at all. It felt as if he were talking about more than just the walls. Of course, he was just a painter. A straight painter, I assumed, with a quiet confidence that came from a life lived without the kind of constant, low-grade anxiety that hummed beneath my own skin. There was no ring on his finger, but that meant nothing. Men like him were never single for long. He was a safe crush, a temporary fixture I could observe from a distance without any risk of complication. An exercise in harmless pining. We agreed on a price and a start date. He shook my hand before he left. His grip was firm, his palm rough and warm. The touch was brief, professional, yet it lingered on my skin long after his truck had rumbled away down the drive, leaving me alone again in the beige silence. But now, the silence felt different. It was charged with anticipation. The following Monday, he arrived precisely at 7. The sound of his truck was the first crack in the placid surface of my morning. He brought with him the smell of fresh paint and coffee, and an energy that filled the house. He set up a small radio on the kitchen counter, and a low murmur of classic rock became the soundtrack to my days. I tried to work in my study, to lose myself in the political intrigues of the 18th century, but my focus was fractured. I was acutely aware of every sound. The scrape of a putty knife, the rhythmic sigh of a paint roller, the soft thud of his boots on the stairs. Sometimes he would hum along to the radio, a low, tuneless sound that was strangely comforting. I would sit at my desk, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, and just listen. I was watching him, I realized, not with my eyes, but with my ears, constructing a picture of him through the sounds of his labor. It felt less intrusive that way, less pathetic. Days bled into one another. The house began to transform. The oppressive beige gave way to a soft, warm gray in the living room, a deep, calming blue in my bedroom. Cole worked with a methodical grace that was captivating. He'd tape the edges of a room with surgical precision, his large frame folded into corners, his focus absolute. I'd watch the muscles in his back and shoulders shift under his shirt as he reached high with a roller. There was a simple, honest beauty in it. The sheer physicality of his work was a language I didn't speak, but deeply admired. Our interactions were minimal, orbiting around logistics. Do you want this trim in semi-gloss or satin? Mind if I use the kitchen sink to clean these brushes? Coffee's on the counter if you want some. I'd offer, my voice always feeling a little too loud in the quiet spaces he created. Thanks, Julian, he'd say, and the casual, easy way he used my name sent a ridiculous jolt through me every single time. He'd smile, a small, tired quirk of his lips, and his green eyes would crinkle at the corners. I would analyze those smiles for hours. Was it just politeness? Or was there a genuine warmth there? I was a historian, trained to find meaning in minutiae, and I was applying the full force of my professional skills to the study of Cole Evans. It was an absurd and deeply private obsession. One afternoon, I was walking down the hall, lost in thought, and didn't see the drop cloth he'd shifted. I stumbled, my arms pinwheeling. A strong hand shot out and clamped onto my lower back, steadying me. The heat of his palm soaked through my shirt, a solid, grounding pressure against my skin. "Whoa there," he said, his voice close to my ear. "Got you." My heart hammered against my ribs. I could smell the faint scent of his sweat, clean and masculine, mingled with the acrid sweetness of the paint. I stood there for a second too long, held in place by his hand. Just us. My heart picked up pace. "Thanks." I managed to breathe, stepping away. The air rushed back into the space where his hand had been, and the spot felt instantly cold. "No problem," he said, turning back to his work as if nothing had happened. But for me, something had. That brief, functional touch became a data point, a piece of evidence I would turn over and over in my mind. It was an accident. It meant nothing, but it had felt like something. It was the first time in a very long time that anyone had touched me with such casual, unthinking care. The house was nearly finished, and a quiet panic was beginning to set in. The colors on the walls were beautiful, exactly what I had wanted. The space felt brighter, more open, more alive. But soon, the radio would be gone. The smell of paint would fade. The comforting presence of Cole would disappear, and I would be left alone in my beautiful, colorful, empty house. The thought was unbearable. The beige was gone from the walls, but I feared it was only gathering itself to settle more deeply inside me. That Thursday, a storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind began to howl, rattling the old window frames. A sudden, violent downpour sent water streaming down the glass. I was in the living room, watching the trees lash back and forth, when Cole appeared in the doorway, his t-shirt soaked through from a run to his truck. "Damn," he said, shaking his head and sending droplets flying. "That came out of nowhere. The window in your bedroom, the one I was scraping, it stuck open. We need to get it closed before the water ruins the sill." We ran upstairs together. Rain was already misting in, peppering the floorboards and the plastic sheeting he'd laid down. The old wooden window was swollen with humidity and wedged tight. "Okay," he grunted, positioning himself. "I'm going to push from the outside edge. You try to pull the sash down from the inside. We'll have to time it." We stood shoulder to shoulder, our arms pressed together in the narrow space. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the solid muscle of his bicep against mine. The rain lashed at us, plastering his shirt to his chest, and the wind was a roaring in my ears. I placed my hands on the wooden sash, my fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, calloused, but the touch was electric. "Ready?" he yelled over the storm. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. We heaved together, a single, coordinated effort. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, groaning crack, the window gave way, slamming shut. We stumbled back, breathing heavily, the roar of the storm instantly muffled. We were in the sudden, intimate quiet of the room, our faces inches apart. His chest rose and fell rapidly. I could see the dark flecks in his green eyes, could count the individual raindrops clinging to his eyelashes. My entire consciousness narrows to this single point in time. The smell of rain and wet earth in him. The sound of our breathing, synchronized and ragged. The sight of his lips, parted slightly. Time stretches, becomes elastic. He isn't moving. He is just looking at me, and his expression is unreadable, a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Something I don't dare put a name to. Then, as quickly as it came, the moment shattered. He took a step back, running a hand through his damp hair. "Well, that was exciting," he said, his voice a little strained. He attempted a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. "Thanks. You probably saved the floor, all part of the service," he quipped, but the easy banter we sometimes shared felt forced now. The air between us had changed. The storm had broken something open, not just the window. We had worked together, our bodies in sync, and the professional boundary between us had been washed away in the downpour. We went downstairs and I made coffee, our movements around each other now slightly awkward, overly cautious. We sat at the kitchen table, listening to the rain drum against the roof. The classic rock station was playing a soft, melancholic song I didn't recognize. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the rain. The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it took my breath away. It was the kind of question no one ever asked me. I stared into my coffee cup, tracing the rim with my finger. Sometimes, I admitted, it was the truest thing I'd said to anyone in years. "It's quiet. Good for writing." But yes. Sometimes, he nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. "I get that," he said. "This job? I'm in a different house every few weeks. Meet a lot of people, but it's always temporary. Always on the surface." He looked at me then, and his eyes were serious, stripped of any professional veneer. "It's been nice working here. It's a good house. Quiet." He didn't say, "It's been nice being with you." He didn't have to. I heard it in the space between his words. We sat in a comfortable silence after that, a silence that felt more intimate than any conversation we'd ever had. We were two lonely men, sitting in a kitchen, listening to the rain, and for a little while, we weren't quite so alone. The vulnerability of that moment, the shared admission of loneliness, was a breakthrough. He wasn't just the handsome painter anymore. He was Cole, a man who understood the quiet ache of solitude. The next day was his last. The final coat was on the last wall. All that was left was cleanup. The house was vibrant, filled with light and color. Every room felt new, hopeful, but a heavy sense of finality hung in the air. His radio was off. The silence was back, but it was a different kind of silence now, filled with unspoken tension. I hovered uselessly, watching him pack up his tools, wipe down his buckets, and fold his drop cloths with the same methodical care he'd applied to every other task. Each packed item felt like a door closing. I was trying to memorize him. The way his brows furrowed in concentration. The precise, efficient movements of his hands. The faded blue of his jeans. My nosy neighbor, Mr. Henderson from across the street, chose that moment to let his dog out. He saw me standing on the porch and ambled over, his gaze flicking from me to Cole's truck in the driveway. "Finishing up, is he?" Mr. Henderson asked, his tone laced with a peculiar kind of insinuation. "He's been here a good long while. Must be a very thorough painter." I felt a hot flush of shame and anger. I knew what he was implying. A single man living alone, another man spending weeks at his house. In a small town, it was enough to start whispers. "He's very professional," I said, my voice tight. Cole came out onto the porch then, carrying a box of supplies. He must have heard. He set the box down and looked at Mr. Henderson, his expression perfectly neutral. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just looked. There was a stillness about him, a coiled strength that was more intimidating than any overt display of aggression. Mr. Henderson, who fancied himself the neighborhood watchdog, seemed to shrink a little under that steady, silent gaze. "Right?" he mumbled, tugging on his dog's leash. "Well, looks good." The house, he beat a hasty retreat back across his manicured lawn. Cole watched him go before turning his gaze to me. I was expecting him to be angry or embarrassed, or to make some kind of joke to dispel the tension. He did none of those things. He just held my eyes, and in their green depths, I saw a flicker of something protective, something fierce. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if to say, "Don't worry about him. He doesn't matter." That small, silent gesture of solidarity meant more to me than any words could have. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't felt the need to distance himself or reassert his masculinity. He had simply stood with me, a silent ally against a small, petty ugliness. The tipping point wasn't a dramatic kiss or a confession. It was that, a quiet, shared moment of defiance on my newly painted porch. He finished his cleanup. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn and setting the new paint inside aglow. My house had never looked more beautiful, or felt more empty. He rolled the final bill up and handed it to me. Our fingers brushed. I was desperate, my mind racing for a way to keep him there for just a few more minutes. Can I get you a beer? I asked, the words tumbling out. As a thank you, for the great work. And for the window. He hesitated for a moment, and my heart sank. He was going to say no. He had a family to get home to, a girlfriend, a life that didn't include me. Yeah, he said finally, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the first real, unguarded smile I'd seen from him all day. Yeah, Julian. I'd like that. I felt a dizzying wave of relief. We sat on the porch steps as dusk settled, the air cooling around us. We drank beer from cold bottles, the condensation dripping onto our hands. The conversation was stilted at first, full of awkward pauses and safe topics. We talked about the town, the weather, the ridiculously long lifespan of cicadas. But underneath the small talk, something else was happening. I was intensely aware of the 6 inches of air between his thigh and mine. Every time he lifted the bottle to his lips, I watched the muscles in his throat work. The silences grew longer, but they weren't empty. They were filled with all the things we weren't saying. I could feel his gaze on me when I was looking away, and when I'd turn to look at him, he'd be staring out at the darkening street, a thoughtful expression on his face. Gonna miss the quiet out here, he said, his voice low. He was looking straight ahead, but I knew he was talking to me. To us. My throat felt tight. The quiet will still be here, I said, and my voice was thick with a meaning I couldn't hide. But you won't be. He turned his head then and looked directly at me. His green eyes were dark in the twilight, searching, asking a question I didn't know how to answer. The air crackled. This was it. The moment where the subtext became text. But I was a coward. I'd spent a lifetime observing from the sidelines, and I didn't know how to step onto the field. I looked away, taking a long, shaky swallow of my beer. The moment passed. He finished his bottle and stood up, stretching his long limbs. Well, he said, the professional tone back in his voice. I should let you get to your evening, right? I said, my heart feeling like a lead weight in my chest. I walked him to his truck. He tossed the empty bottle into a recycling bin in the back with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet evening. He turned to face me. I left a few brushes to soak in the sink, he said. I'll just grab them, and then I'll be out of your hair for good. The words echoed in my head. I followed him back inside, into the kitchen. The room was filled with the scent of him, of paint thinner, and the faint, sweet smell of the new paint on the walls. It smelled like change. It smelled like him. He stood at the sink, his back to me, rinsing the last of the brushes under the running water. The simple, domestic act was unbearably poignant. I watched the steady movement of his hands, the water sluicing over his stained fingers. This was the end. In a minute, he would dry his hands, say goodbye, and walk out of my life, leaving me in this beautiful, colorful tomb I'd asked him to create. The gray was coming back, a cold tide rising inside me, threatening to wash away all the new color. I couldn't let him leave. I couldn't go back to the beige. I had to say something. Anything. Thank you, I said, my voice cracking on the second word. For everything. He stilled, the water still running. He slowly, deliberately, turned off the faucet. The sudden silence was deafening. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his shoulders tense. Then he set the bucket down on the floor with a soft, final thud. He turned. He moved. He crossed the small space between us in 2 long strides. His hands came up to cup my face, his palms rough and warm against my skin. His thumbs stroked my cheekbones. His eyes, those impossible green eyes, searched mine, and in them, I saw every unspoken question, every lingering glance, every moment of shared silence from the past few weeks. And I saw the answer. This is it. My mind goes completely blank. There are no words, no historical precedents, no carefully constructed analyses. There is only the here and now. The rough texture of his calluses against my jaw, the scent of soap and turpentine and the warm, male scent of his skin. the way the fading light from the window catches the scar in his eyebrow. He leaned in, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a statement. It was firm and sure and breathtakingly honest. It was a kiss that tasted of beer and longing and weeks of unspoken tension. It was the kiss of a man who had made a decision. And in that moment, all the color he had brushed onto my walls flooded into me. The warm gray of the living room, the deep blue of my bedroom, the brilliant, hopeful white of the trim. It all rushed into the beige, colorless spaces inside me, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt vibrant. I felt alive. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. Our breaths mingled in the small space between us. I kept my eyes closed, trying to sear the feeling of his lips on mine into my memory. I started, but my voice was gone. "Shoo," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against my skin. "It's okay, but was it?" The kiss had been a cataclysm, shattering the quiet, predictable world I had built for myself. Now, in the aftershock, a terrifying silence descended. What happened now? My mind, my old, treacherous friend, kicked back into gear. This was a mistake, a moment of madness. He was going to apologize, look embarrassed, and flee, leaving me doubly broken. I was so paralyzed by the fear of what would come next that I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stood there, his hand still cradling my face, my heart threatening to beat its way out of my chest. He must have felt the tremor that went through me. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes again. The searching look was gone, replaced by a steady, reassuring calm. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't running. He was just there, waiting. I wasn't imagining that, was I? He asked, his voice soft, almost gentle. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, an invitation for me to confirm what had just passed between us. I finally found my voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "No, you weren't imagining it." A slow, relieved smile touched his lips. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. He dropped one hand from my face, and his fingers found mine, lacing through them. His grip was strong, definite. A simple, grounding gesture that said more than any pretty words could. "I'm not going anywhere." "Good," he said simply. The internal test began immediately. My anxiety, a coiled snake, began to uncurl in my stomach. This isn't real. He's confused. He'll regret this in the morning. People like you don't get this. You don't get the strong, quiet painter with sea glass eyes. The old scripts, the ones I had written for myself over years of loneliness, began to play in my head. But then I looked at our joined hands. His, stained with paint and marked by labor. Mine, pale and smooth from a life spent with books. They fit together perfectly, and I looked at his face. He wasn't looking at me with pity or confusion. He was looking at me with a simple, unnerving clarity, as if he had been seeing me, really seeing me, all along. "I've wanted to do that for a week," he confessed, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "Ever since that damn window a week. While I had been torturing myself, dissecting every glance and casual touch, he had just wanted me." The simplicity of it was staggering. It cut through the complex web of my anxieties. This wasn't a story I was writing. This was real. We stood there in the kitchen for a long time, not talking, just holding hands and breathing in the new reality of the room. We had to talk, eventually. We had to figure out what this was, what we were. But for now, the silence was enough. "I thought you were straight," I finally admitted, the words feeling foolish on my tongue. He gave a short, wry laugh. "I thought I was too. For a long time. Turns out, I'm just quiet about it." He squeezed my hand. "And you're very distracting, Julian." The way he said my name, the easy warmth in it, finally silenced the last of my doubts. We made a conscious choice then, not with words, but with a shared look. A decision to step off the edge of our lonely, separate worlds and into this new, uncharted territory together. He didn't leave that night. He helped me order pizza, and we ate it sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and the evidence of his hard work. He told me about growing up in a small town, about the pressure to be a certain kind of man. I told him about my quiet life, about the ghosts I lived with in my books. We talked for hours, filling in the sketches we'd made of each other with the solid, vibrant colors of our real lives. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I walked into the kitchen to find him standing at my counter, wearing a spare t-shirt I'd given him, pouring 2 mugs. He wasn't a contractor anymore. He was just a man in my kitchen, a man who had kissed me, a man who had stayed. The quiet, domestic intimacy of the scene was more profound than any grand, romantic gesture. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing mine. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, a real, genuine smile spreading across my face. We took our coffee out to the porch and sat on the steps, the same steps where we'd had our awkward beer the evening before. The world felt different now. The morning sun was warm on my face. The birdsong seemed clearer, the green of the leaves on the trees more intense. I looked at my house, at the fresh coat of paint that gleamed in the light. It was beautiful. It was a symbol of the change I had craved. But it wasn't the paint that had saved me. It was the painter. He was looking at me, a soft, contented expression on his face. He reached over and took my hand again, his thumb tracing idle circles on my palm. He didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to ask. I thought about my old life, the one that had existed just a few weeks ago. The beige walls, the hollow silence, the feeling of being a ghost in my own home. It all seemed like a lifetime away, a biography of a different man. Cole hadn't just put color on my walls. He had set a bucket down at my sink and kissed the color back into me, filling the empty spaces with a quiet, steady, and breathtaking hope. I was no longer alone in the quiet. I looked at him, his hand holding mine, and I felt like I had finally, truly, come home.